Scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helps solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
In 2025, something extraordinary happened to one of history's most enduring mysteries. After more than 137 years of speculation, obsession, and unanswered questions, headlines across the world declared that the identity of Jack the Ripper had finally been confirmed. The claim was bold, definitive, and deeply unsettling. According to renewed DNA analysis, historical cross-referencing, and modern forensic interpretation, the man responsible for the infamous Whitechapel murders was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant barber who had long lingered in the margins of police suspicion. For generations, the Ripper existed not as a confirmed individual, but as a symbol, a faceless embodiment of Victorian fear. He was a shadow moving through gaslit streets, a figure half-formed in fog and panic, more legend than man. His anonymity allowed him to evolve into myth. That myth endured precisely because no one could decisively collapse it into a single human identity. Yet in 2025, that changed. The mystery was no longer presented as open-ended. It was reframed as resolved. When a case this iconic is declared closed, the shift is not merely academic. It transforms speculation into record, possibility into narrative, and suspicion into public memory. A verdict delivered more than a century later does not only identify a suspect, it reshapes how generations will interpret an era. The question that now confronts us is not only whether Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. The deeper question is what it means for history when uncertainty, long preserved, is replaced with certainty. Whitechapel, 1888, the world that birthed the Ripper. To understand the magnitude of the 2025 claim, we must return to Whitechapel in 1888. Victorian London was the capital of a vast empire, projecting power and industrial achievement to the world. Yet, within the East End, reality was far more fragile. Whitechapel was defined by overcrowding, unstable labor, disease, and simmering resentment. Immigrant communities, including many Jewish families fleeing persecution, lived in tightly packed streets under economic pressure and social suspicion. Women at the margins of society often relied on prostitution to secure nightly lodging. Survival was transactional. Vulnerability was constant. In this environment, a series of killings unfolded between late August and November of 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Strye, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. These 5 women would later be known collectively as the Canonical Five. The murders shared geographic proximity and disturbing elements of abdominal mutilation. In certain cases, organs were removed. The violence escalated. The killer appeared to move with confidence through narrow streets and dark courtyards. Newspapers amplified the horror. Letters allegedly written by the killer arrived at police stations and editorial offices, some signed Jack the Ripper. One infamous message, known as the From Hell letter, included a portion of a human kidney. Whether genuine or fabricated, the psychological effect was devastating. The murderer was no longer an unknown assailant. He had become a named presence haunting the city. Police efforts intensified. Hundreds were questioned. Patrols increased. Suspects were scrutinized. Theories multiplied. Doctors, butchers, foreigners, aristocrats. Yet no arrest resulted in conviction. After Mary Jane Kelly's murder in November 1888, the killings ceased. The silence that followed allowed myth to grow. Jack the Ripper became a symbol of unresolved terror, a reminder that even the heart of empire could harbor shadows beyond the reach of authority. It is that shadow the 2025 announcement seeks to define. The barber in the records. A suspect, hidden in plain sight. For decades, the Whitechapel murders attracted names the way open cases attract theories. Each generation seemed determined to find its own villain. Montague John Druitt was one of the earliest serious candidates. A barrister whose body was found in the Thames weeks after the final canonical murder. His apparent suicide aligned suspiciously with the sudden end of the killings. The timing raised eyebrows inside Scotland Yard, but evidence tying him directly to the crime scenes never materialized. Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born criminal with a history of fraud and mental instability, briefly surfaced in investigative records. Yet later findings suggested he may not even have been in London during the murders. Francis Tumblety, an American doctor known for misogynistic attitudes and an unsettling fascination with preserved female organs, was present in London during the killings and fled soon after being arrested on unrelated charges. His profile disturbed investigators, but no direct proof ever placed him in Whitechapel's narrow courtyards at the critical hours. In the decades that followed, the suspect pool expanded. James Maybrick emerged through a diary many scholars dismiss as a forgery. Walter Sickert was accused based on artistic interpretation and circumstantial speculation. Even Prince Albert Victor became entangled in elaborate royal conspiracy theories unsupported by credible documentation. These names captured imagination. They fueled books, documentaries, and endless debate. But most were constructed after the fact, retrofitted onto a mystery that refused to die. One name, however, did not originate from later speculation. It appeared in police records written by men who had worked the case. That name was Aaron Kosminski. Unlike the more theatrical suspects, Kosminski was not discovered decades later by authors searching for intrigue. He was identified internally by Scotland Yard within years of the murders themselves. In 1894, Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville McNayton drafted a confidential memorandum naming 3 primary suspects. Kosminski was one of them. He was not a barrister, not a doctor, not an aristocrat. He was a local man. Born in 1865 in Poland, Kosminski immigrated to London in the early 1880s, fleeing anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe. He settled in Whitechapel, blending into a densely packed immigrant community struggling under poverty and prejudice. He worked as a barber, a quiet trade that required dexterity with sharp instruments and steady hands. More importantly, he lived within walking distance of the murder sites. He navigated the same streets where the bodies were found. He passed through the same alleys illuminated by gaslight. He was not a visitor to Whitechapel's darkness. He was part of it. McNaughton's memorandum described him as harboring strong hostility toward women and exhibiting violent tendencies. Other references within police documents suggested that investigators privately considered him a serious suspect but lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute. There were reports of a potential witness identification during a private procedure, yet no testimony was ever brought into public court. Why? Some historians suggest fear of provoking anti-Semitic unrest in an already volatile district. Others point to the limitations of Victorian policing. No forensic science, no fingerprint databases, no DNA analysis. Suspicion alone could not secure conviction. As years passed, Kosminski's mental health deteriorated significantly. By 1891, he had been committed to Coney Hatch Asylum. Medical records describe hallucinations, paranoid delusions, social withdrawal, and escalating instability. He reportedly threatened family members and exhibited profound psychological fragmentation. he would remain institutionalized for the rest of his life, dying in 1919. Notably, the Whitechapel murders had ceased before his confinement. The killings ended. He was removed from society. The violence never resumed. That alignment has long lingered in Ripper scholarship, not as proof, but as a detail that refuses to disappear. For decades, Aaron Kosminski's name remained confined to archival documents and specialist debate. He was neither exonerated nor proven guilty. He existed in that uneasy space between possibility and certainty. Until the 21st century, when a controversial artifact and modern DNA testing would pull him out of the margins and place him at the very center of the world's most famous unsolved mystery. The shawl and the modern DNA breakthrough. The object that reignited the case was a shawl allegedly recovered near Catherine Eddowes' body on September 30, 1888. Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square. Her body discovered shortly after 1:45 a.m. Her injuries were extensive and included the removal of a kidney and part of her uterus. The shawl in question, described as a large silk and wool garment with ornate patterns, was said to have been found near her remains. According to family tradition, Sergeant Amos Simpson removed the shawl from the crime scene and preserved it. There is no official police documentation confirming its cataloging or removal, and its chain of custody relies largely on anecdotal accounts passed through generations. Nevertheless, in 2007, the shawl was purchased at auction by author Russell Edwards, who believed it might still hold biological traces from the night of the murder. The shawl itself raised questions even before testing began. Some textile historians noted that its elaborate design suggested it may have been too expensive for Eddowes, a woman living in severe poverty, to have owned. Others argued it could have been second-hand or discarded. That uncertainty alone complicated assumptions about its origin. Edwards collaborated with molecular biologist Dr. Jari Louhelainen to examine the fabric using modern forensic tools. Under ultraviolet light, investigators identified several stains not visible to the naked eye. Microscopic analysis suggested the presence of blood proteins. Louhelainen later stated that some of the blood patterns were consistent with arterial spray and transfer stains, though these interpretations remain debated among forensic specialists. Researchers also suggested that certain biological traces aligned with Catherine Eddowes' documented medical condition, Bright's disease, a chronic kidney disorder that could produce specific markers in blood and bodily fluids. This detail was presented as a compelling alignment between historical medical records and laboratory findings. The most consequential step involved mitochondrial DNA analysis. Unlike nuclear DNA, which can uniquely identify an individual, mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally and shared among maternal relatives. Louhelainen extracted mitochondrial DNA from stains on the shawl and compared the sequences to living descendants from the maternal lines of both Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. The reported findings indicated a match. However, mitochondrial DNA testing does not provide the same level of individual specificity as nuclear DNA profiling. It can exclude suspects more reliably than it can conclusively identify one. In densely populated 19th-century Whitechapel, particularly within immigrant communities sharing common ancestry, similar mitochondrial sequences may have existed among multiple individuals. Further scrutiny focused on laboratory transparency. Critics pointed out that the full DNA sequence data was not publicly released, making independent replication difficult. The sample size, handling procedures, and statistical probabilities became central points of contention within the scientific community. Questions also emerged regarding contamination. The shawl had not been preserved under modern forensic standards. Over more than a century, it passed through numerous hands without protective protocols. Victorian-era investigators did not use gloves or evidence bags. Later owners, collectors, and auction handlers may also have introduced modern DNA. Distinguishing original 19th century biological material from subsequent contamination presents an immense technical challenge. In 2024, the Journal of Forensic Sciences issued an expression of concern, noting missing raw data and issues surrounding reproducibility. Some geneticists criticized the study's methodology, arguing that extraordinary historical claims require extraordinary evidentiary transparency. Supporters, however, maintained that when combined with archival suspicion, geographic proximity, and institutional records, the DNA evidence strongly reinforced the case against Kosminski. What began as a piece of fabric had become a scientific flashpoint. The debate moved beyond science into the realm of historical responsibility, raising not only the question of what the shawl proves, but what it means to declare a century-old mystery finally solved. Closure, controversy, and the weight of historical judgment. The renewed identification of Kosminski did not remain confined to academic discourse. Descendants of Catherine Eddowes publicly called for formal acknowledgement, emphasizing a desire for recognition rather than punishment. For families of victims, uncertainty can feel like an inherited wound, passed down through generations without resolution. Yet, historical declarations carry consequences on multiple fronts. Aaron Kosminski never stood trial for the murders. He was never convicted in a court of law. Assigning him definitive responsibility more than a century later alters his legacy permanently. If the DNA claim is accurate, it represents long-delayed clarity. If it is flawed, it risks cementing an unproven accusation into public consciousness. Furthermore, debate persists regarding whether all 5 canonical murders were committed by a single individual. Elizabeth Stride's case, in particular, has been cited by some researchers as differing in key aspects from the others. If multiple perpetrators were involved, the assumption of a singular ripper becomes more complex. Declaring closure in such a case is not merely about satisfying curiosity. It is about determining how history will remember an era, its victims, and its failures. Certainty can offer comfort, but it can also narrow interpretation. Memory, evidence, and the persistence of the fog. The endurance of the Jack the Ripper mystery has always been intertwined with its incompleteness. The absence of resolution forced attention toward broader social realities: poverty, misogyny, institutional limitations, and urban vulnerability in Victorian London. Modern forensic technology has solved countless cold cases, creating an expectation that every historical mystery can be illuminated with sufficient scientific advancement. The attempt to apply DNA analysis to a 19th century crime reflects that optimism. Yet we must remember that the original investigation unfolded in a world without modern evidence preservation. Crime scenes were not secured as they would be today. Biological materials were not catalogued with future DNA analysis in mind. Records were incomplete. Documentation was inconsistent. We are asking 21st century science to clarify events that unfolded in an era unprepared for such scrutiny. The identification of Aaron Kosminski may represent the strongest convergence of archival suspicion and genetic testing available to us. It may indeed point toward the most plausible explanation history can offer. But plausibility does not automatically equal absolute proof. The fog over Whitechapel has thinned in the modern era, illuminated by laboratory light rather than gas lamps. Yet it has not disappeared entirely. The 5 women remain at the center of the story, not as symbols of myth, but as individuals whose lives were violently taken. Whether Aaron Kosminski was the man responsible remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. What is certain is that when we transform a century-old mystery into a definitive verdict, we do more than solve a puzzle. We shape collective memory. redefine narrative, and assume responsibility for how future generations will understand the past. If this exploration challenged your perspective, share your thoughts below. Do you believe the case has finally been resolved, or does uncertainty still deserve its place in history? Subscribe for more investigations where evidence, memory, and myth intersect.